Cold Case, an Angelica Dale Mystery by P.K. Armstrong. Chapter 13. I had decided that I needed to get into a routine of running in the morning. Sandy was an excellent cook. If I stayed with the Rolands for too long, I would gain some serious pounds. My 5 a.m. run through the neighborhood was cold, but there was no precipitation and it was well above freezing, so I didn't have to worry about a fall. I had passed only one other jogger in the trash truck. The morning fog muted the sound of my feet pounding on the pavement. The houses and trees seemed wrapped in a fine gauze. Adrenaline was racing through my body, but my thoughts were not chaotic. Maybe it was the silence or the solitude of the early morning. My brain began conjuring up images from my board in the little office, repositioning them and pulling some into focus. Pound, 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 my feet continuously hit the pavement. Since there was nothing for my energies to rage against, the pictures seemed to move faster and shift into place. By the time I reached the house, my next steps were clear, and I was anxious to get started. Besides my hunt for crime scene pictures, I knew I needed to find out more about who Stormie Gyles was at the time of the fire. I also thought it was important to delve deeper into Derek and exactly who he was having an affair with. Finally, I needed to see if I could schedule an interview with Bailey and Corey's surviving family members. "You were up early," Sandy said when I came through the front door. "Yeah," I responded, taking a breath. "I felt the need to run this morning." Looking into the sitting room and listening for voices, I asked, "Is Jacob still here?" Sandy looked at me questioning. "Yeah, he's just in the kitchen." She followed me as I walked into the airy kitchen. Jacob and Chuck were putting dishes into the dishwasher. "Jacob, if I can get you more images of the crime scene, can you finish your rendering?" "Jacob," Chuck said sternly, "I told you to keep your nose out of Angel's case." "Oh, Jacob," Sandy said, shaking her head. "No, no, please don't be angry with him. It is okay. I don't mind if we talk about it amongst ourselves because I know you guys won't mention it outside of this house. Besides, he was really helpful." I turned to Jacob. "Jacob?" Jacob grinned at his parents and gave a cocky "I told you so" shake of his head and looked at me. "Yeah, do you think you can get more pictures of the club after the fire?" "Yes, I'm hoping so. Your brother got me a partial police file, but when it comes to fire victims, often crime scene photos are included in the file sent to the medical examiner to match wounds and such. I'm hoping they still have photos available." "Nice. Let me know. I have the software on my laptop, so I can do it here at the house." "Thanks, Jacob." I turned away and Sandy called to me. "Will you eat a breakfast sandwich?" I turned back. "Yes, but please don't feel obligated to get my meals for me. I'm not consistent with my meals when I'm working a case," I admitted. "That's exactly what Christopher said. He said he often finds you haven't eaten the whole day when you are busy on a case, and he tries to make sure you've had at least one good meal." I smiled, slightly embarrassed. I didn't realize he was keeping track. Sandy noticed my embarrassment and smiled a knowing smile. "You go shower and dress. I will have a sandwich down here ready for you by the time you are done." I smiled gratefully, gave her my thanks, and ran up the stairs. The Shasta County Medical Examiner was located on the outskirts of town. It seemed to me that most medical examiner offices looked the same on the outside. Large, square-shaped, efficient-looking buildings with small windows. I imagined that ambiance wasn't high on the list for the building designers. On the inside, the medical examiner's office did not have Fillmore's new upgraded state-of-the-art equipment, but it was still sterile, adequate, and well organized. I entered the reception area and immediately came face to face with a wall of glass with two pairs of eyes staring at me. I smiled at the young man because the woman who had been talking to him exited the area as I approached. "Hello, I was wanting to know what your procedure was for releasing details of autopsies from 40 years ago. You have a form for the Freedom of Information Act?" Something I said caused the young man's eyes to grow wide because they looked like saucers. "Autopsies? As in plural?" What exactly are you looking for? I smiled, realizing it did sound a little extreme. Yes, I'm looking for copies of the reports from a fire 40 years ago at the Aspen Club. I paused, giving my request a chance to sink in, considering the young man I was talking to wasn't even a twinkle in his father's eye the year the Aspen Club went up in flames. Well, of course, we recognize the Freedom of Information Act. I can give you the form, but I'm not sure if those records are kept on site. I'll have to ask Connie. He went to a file cabinet, pulled out some forms, and slid them under the slot in the plexiglass wall. I handed him my business card, declined his pen, sat down, pulled out my own, and began completing the form. It took a few moments until the woman who was previously behind the glass entered a side door and called to me. Miss Dale? Yes. I stood and moved closer to the glass. Have you finished the form? She asked pointedly. Yes, actually, I have. The medical examiner would like to speak with you. Surprised, I agreed and moved to the door as she buzzed the security lock and let me in. I followed her down a neutral tone hallway, listening to her heels click on the light pink vinyl flooring. We passed no other staff in the hallway, but it wasn't unusual. Medical examiners' offices tended to have a small number of staff. We entered a short hallway, and Connie knocked on the door at the end and opened it before she heard a response. I was ushered into a cluttered office with a small window. The blinds were open, allowing the ineffectual morning light entry. Nothing could soften the cold clinical fluorescent bulbs that illuminated the room at this hour. There were papers on top of papers, some even on the floor. The room was slightly stuffy, made more so when Connie exited and closed the door behind her. The man behind the desk seemed to fit in with the old oak furniture, solid and dependable. Craig Carson, M.D., county medical examiner, was in his early 60s. His eyes were framed with bushy brows, his mouth by a stark white beard. The contrast with his dark skin was striking. His deep voice seemed to draw me in. It was almost hypnotic. Angelica Dale, private investigator. He read from my card. Please sit. I looked down to the nearest chair, not surprised it was covered with file folders. I removed them and placed them on top of another pile, not removing my hand until I was sure they were balanced, and sat in the chair. I looked up to find Dr. Carson smiling at me. I smiled back. A normal person is probably disconcerted when they meet the beautiful woman behind the business card. I smiled again. However, I've been doing this for 30 years. I've seen everything, and I'm not easily disconcerted. He smiled back. Thank you, I said, graciously accepting the compliment. You wanted to speak with me? Connie tells me you have an interest in the Aspen Club fire victims. I considered him carefully. How much should I tell him? In a different setting with trees, rocks, tents, and naturistic music, he would be a wise man, beckoning all to come to him to hear his words and be enlightened. My thoughts amused me, but I knew it would be inappropriate to laugh, so I covered it by clearing my throat. The fact that I'm looking into the fire isn't common knowledge, I said carefully. He reclined in his chair, resting both of his arms on his head and putting his feet on the desk. I imagine not. Although no one probably cares any longer, it's easier to get the truth from people if they don't know you are coming. He gave me a direct look. No one will hear it from me. I nodded. I've been asked to take a look at Stormie Gyles' involvement in the case. Well, now, why did I put it that way? I considered briefly and then continued. It would be great if you had photos of some of the injuries. I looked at the doctor to see how my words were affecting him. His face showed nothing. A thought came to me. You don't seem old enough to have been here at the medical examiner's office back then. He shook his head. No, I wasn't, but I was an ER doctor and on duty the night of the fire and when they brought one of the victims in. I froze and my mouth dropped open. I silently kicked myself over my blatant error of assumption. It must have shown on my face because the doctor was quick to notice. What? What did I say? I sighed heavily and shook my head. I'm such an idiot to make a rookie mistake, I grunted, and then admitted. I assumed all the victims that night died in the fire, their bodies retrieved in situ after the fire was extinguished. I didn't realize someone survived initially and later succumbed to their injuries. Understandable. It was usually just reported 4 dead in the fire. Details would have been in the police and fire reports, which you probably don't have access to. I nodded, grateful the doctor didn't make me feel worse than I already did. He stared at me for a moment, tilted his head, and gave me a slow, lazy smile. The victim that initially survived was Sasha Johnson. She arrived at the ER with burns over 83% of her body. It was the first time I had seen a burn victim come in like that. It was strange how her eyes were wide open. She had burns on her face, but she could still move her mouth. She kept saying, "Higher?" She was in shock. She spoke? I asked, shocked. Yes, briefly. Of course, she was sedated soon after that. She was still in some pain, but she died 2 days later. The detectives asked the ER staff about it. I think they concluded that she was in agony, declaring, "Fire, fire." I sat in stunned silence. What could she have meant? I needed to get back to the house and look at the information on file to see if I could cross-reference that word. I forgot where I was for the moment, that is, until Dr. Carson cleared his throat. I looked up to find him staring at me again. He sat up straight and took the Freedom of Information form I had completed. "If you can wait, I will give you what we have, but it must be within the scope of this request. But I may be able to help you. Are you familiar with Detective Frank Burns? He was one of the detectives on the case. He is a friend of mine as well as a colleague. Truthfully, he wasn't quite satisfied with the case they put together and presented to the district attorney's office. But he was a new detective at the time and didn't feel he could question his superiors." I sat up a little straighter. "Is he still around? Can I talk to him?" "Yes, sort of," Dr. Carson responded cryptically. I'm certain my face showed my confusion because Dr. Carson gave me a small smile. "Frank is in Twin Pines skilled nursing facility. He's not long for this world. But if you catch him on a good day, he might share something helpful, or," this time Dr. Carson gave me a huge grin, "he might just let you see the case file he borrowed from the police department."